We're continuing our series of workshops on emotional sobriety. Dr. Berger speaks to our group on the first Monday of every month. This is the last one this year. Tonight is the 10th part of his discussion of how we can apply the 12 essential insights for emotional sobriety. That's the title of his latest book. And so he's going to tonight talk to us about healing through forgiveness. And that's the 10th insight. I'm looking forward to it in particular because I've had a lot of hard work on forgiveness, and I'm sure he's going to teach me some new avenues to approach forgiveness. So take it away, Alan, and you can talk as long as you want. Look at that.
Oh my goodness.
I know you always have a time, so I'm safe in saying
I
that.
feel like 007 right now, like I've got a license to kill. You gotta watch out giving me all of that unrestricted room. Well, thank you. And it's always a pleasure to be here with the Berlin group. And I want to wish all of you happy holidays and let's make next year the best year of our life, huh? And we've been doing a lot of work this year, and I've appreciated all of you that have been attending and you know, absorbing and assimilating all of this information that I've been passing on to you all year. And to you, Patrick and Susie, thank you so much for this opportunity to share with your group. So today, as Susie mentioned, we're going to be digging into the 10th essential insight in terms of the process of developing a practice of emotional sobriety. As Susie mentioned, this is insight number 10, healing through forgiveness. And as through these months that we've been really building up, looking at the process that's involved in developing what I like to think of as a consciousness of emotional freedom. So this is all based on this book that's available through Amazon. So think of emotional sobriety as a practice that helps us move beyond a consciousness that demands absolute thinking. And we'll see that this absolute thinking really happened very early on in our development. At a very, very early age, we started to really think of the world in very black and white terms. And there's a psychological reason for that. It just kind of made the world a bit more understandable in a weird way, even though it turns out that this wasn't the best solution possible. It also created a sense of safety. That if I could go ahead and divide the world up to good and bad, then at least I know what good and bad is. And that's going to give me a way to navigate it. I think as the older I've gotten, and hopefully with a little bit of maturity in my life, that I see that some of these ideas I had in good and bad were really very, very much artificial. And that today I try not to think in terms of what's good and bad, but I think more in terms of what's healthy and what's unhealthy, because some of the things I thought were bad actually turned out to be quite healthy. Some of the things I thought were good actually weren't that healthy. I mean, so like beer, and drinking and getting drunk, I thought that was a really good thing at a certain point in my life. Today, I don't think that way. I can see that as unhealthy for me since I suffer from this disease of alcoholism and drug addiction. So we want to move beyond this consciousness of right and wrong, of black and white, and move us towards a consciousness that is less absolute, that's more flexible, that's more responsive, that's more tolerant of mistakes. And this creates then a consciousness of emotional freedom. And that's what we're really looking for. So emotional sobriety really is this practice that transforms an I'm okay if consciousness. Because that's the consciousness that really was strongly, put in place early on in my life into a consciousness that's based on much more flexibility. I'm okay even if things don't turn out the way I think they're supposed to be. I'm okay if things don't turn out the way I'd like them to be. I'm okay if things aren't what they should be. So this kind of consciousness, this creates a consciousness of emotional freedom. You could think about it as a consciousness that's based on emotional autonomy.
Suddenly, I realized what the matter was. My basic flaw had always been dependence, almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply me with prestige, security, and the like. Failing to get these things according to my perfectionist dreams and specifications, I had fought for them. And when defeat came, so did my depression.
So you can see that Bill was really telling us that he had this consciousness that was based on I'm okay if. He talked about this is that his dependence created this almost absolute dependence on people or circumstances to supply him with self-prestige. Think of that as self-esteem, security, emotional security, and the like. See, his sense of self was what we call a reflected sense of self, that his sense of himself was dependent on how other people were responding to him and treating him. And when things didn't go according to he called it his perfectionistic dreams and specifications, he fought for them, meaning he tried to get things to go his way. And there's a lot of different ways that we do that, a lot of different, maneuvers or strategies we have. But when they didn't, when he felt defeated, he became deflated and he got depressed because he didn't know what to do when things didn't go the way, quote, they were supposed to go. That was his incredible insight into the problem that was interfering with this emotional sobriety.
There wasn't a chance of making the outgoing love of St. Francis a workable and joyous way of life until these fatal and almost absolute dependencies were cut away. Because I had over the years undergone a little spiritual development, the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies had never before been so starkly revealed.
So what he realized is that what was interfering with Bill becoming the person that he wanted to be the person that he could be, was these fatal and almost absolute dependencies. When he describes them as fatal, they really are. I think these are responsible for so many homicides in terms of romantic relationships. I mean, so many people taking their lives and suicide. I mean, it's a deadly, deadly thing to have when we expect the world to be a certain way for us to be okay. And when it doesn't happen, if we don't know how to deal with that, things can get pretty crazy pretty fast. Now, Bill said he had to cut these things away, which means he had to move beyond a consciousness that expected environmental support and move towards a consciousness that was more grounded in Bill learning how to support himself, how to regulate himself. That's the current pop psychology phrase today, self-regulation. Everybody's talking about self-regulation. Well, Bill and other people at this time, because Bill wasn't the only one talking about these things. There was many psychologists, as if you know of my work in any way, I try to present a lot of the masters of psychotherapy, their thoughts and ideas about this stuff, is that this was part of the spirit of the times, part of the zeitgeist. So Bill really believed that if we become aware of these things, and this is what he talks about here, that these things were starkly revealed, that the absolute quality of these frightful dependencies really came into clear focus in his consciousness. And that is something each and every one of us need to do. We need to become aware of how our life is determined by these forces. In fact, creating a consciousness of emotional freedom is dependent on an awareness of how our life is being determined by these things.
Reinforced by what grace I could secure in prayer, I found I had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies upon people, upon AA, indeed upon any act or circumstance whatsoever. Then could I be free to love as Francis did. emotional and instinctual satisfactions I saw were really the extra dividends of having love, offering love, and expressing love appropriate to each relation of life.
Well, here's where we see that Bill really made a commitment to dealing with this, right? He had to cut off every, he had to exert every ounce of will and action to cut off these faulty emotional dependencies. He says upon people, we understand that. A lot of people are surprised that he said upon AA. But when we start to think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because AA, the 12 steps, the principles and practicing the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, are really designed to help us discover emotional sobriety. And Bill said as much in the 12 and 12. If you go to his discussion of step 12, you'll see, I think it's in the first paragraph near the end of it, he says, if we practice these principles in our daily lives, that we and those about us begin to find emotional sobriety. That's the expressly stated purpose of working this program, is to establish a practice of emotional sobriety. Now, when this happens, then we come close to being able to have unconditional love. What Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard. We do not put expectations on how people should be, meaning that I am the way I am because of what I want to do, not because of who you are. And that's the unconditional quality of our behavior that's achieved when we start to practice this emotional sobriety.
Plainly, I could not avail myself to God's love until I was able to offer it back to Him by loving others as He would have me. And I couldn't possibly do that so long as I was victimized by false dependencies. For my dependencies meant demand, a demand for the possession and control of the people and the conditions surrounding me. While those words absolute dependence may look like a gimmick, they were the ones that helped to trigger my release into my present degree of stability and quietness of mind, qualities which I am now trying to consolidate by offering love to others, regardless of the return to me.
So this is very important to realize, that we are incredibly much victimized by our false dependencies. They have an incredibly toxic impact on our entire life in terms of our relationship with ourselves, with others, even with our higher power. And I'm hoping you're going to be able to see what I mean by that as we go along today.
Of course, I haven't offered you a really new idea, only a gimmick that has started to unhook several of my own hexes at depth. Nowadays, my brain no longer races compulsively in either elation, grandiosity, or depression. I've been given a quiet place in bright sunshine.
I love the image that comes to my mind when Bill uses the word unhook. Because, see, that's what your emotional dependency does. It hooks you. It puts all these conditions on what's supposed to happen for you to be okay. And to start to develop a practice of emotional sobriety, you have to unhook yourself from all of these ideas so that you can discover something new. And hopefully that's what we're going to be doing today. I think stage 2 recovery, and what Ernie Larson talked about, is really dependent on this emotional sobriety. Ernie describes stage 2 recovery as this. It's about dealing with the mountain of living, is what stage 2 recovery is all about. It is getting on with life by facing those patterns, habits, and attitudes that control your life, and which, for perhaps the first time, you're clear-headed, sober, or emotionally sound enough to face. So what we've been doing over these this year, is we've been looking at what these patterns are and these habits are. Earlier on, I talked about the importance of being able to discern our emotional dependency. So please, if you haven't heard some of the previous talks, go to the WhatsApp, application, WhatsApp link, and you'll be able to find all of these previous workshops there, and please listen to them, and it'll help you make a lot more sense out of what we're going to be doing today. So it's beyond the scope of my talk to talk about all of the things we talked about beforehand, because we would need a week to do that. So we're going to stay focused today on number 10. And what is insight number 10? It's healing through forgiveness. Well, I think as we get into this, you're going to understand what makes this so important, but it really is that forgiveness helps us take back our power and recover our emotional balance. It helps us regain our emotional center of gravity. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Some of you know I'm a Marine. I was a combat Marine in Vietnam from 1970 to 71. And when we were training for a mission that was likely to have hand-to-hand combat, or that was possibility of us having hand-to-hand combat, they assigned 2 Korean Marines, 2 ROCs to our unit to teach us Taekwondo. And one of the first things that they taught us was the horse stance. In Korean, I can't remember the Korean words for it, but it's called the immovable stance. And so what happens is your feet are a little bit wider than shoulder width apart, and you bend your knees. And when I was a young man, I used to be able to bend my knees. Now that's a little bit more challenging at 70 years old. Susie's smiling. She knows just what I mean by that. And so you would drop down into this stance, and what would happen is your weight would be equally distributed over both feet. Your center of gravity was low. So if somebody pushed me, I would be able to absorb that force. Now, if I lifted up my center of gravity and I was no longer, bringing my center of gravity low, you could push me. And especially if I was on one leg, it would be easy to knock me off balance. But in that immovable stance, it was very hard to knock me off balance. So my center of physical gravity is when gravity is passing through me and connecting me to the earth, to the center of the earth. See, that's our physical center of gravity. It's amazing to see what really, great athletes can do with this. Watching, a female gymnast on the balance beam is mind-blowing to me. It looks like they're doing all those routines on the floor, and it's about a 4-inch, piece of wood that they're standing on, or 3 inches. It's remarkable, but it's all because they know how to manage their physical center of gravity and control it. Well, you also have an emotional center of gravity. And when your emotional center of gravity is connected to who you are, your authentic self, it's pretty hard to knock you off balance. The more grounded you are in, or the more grounded you're into yourself, if you will, the more difficult it is for someone to come and knock you off balance. But the minute I take my emotional center of gravity and give it to you, guess what happens? Now my emotional balance is depending on how you treat me. And if you treat me the way that I want you to treat me, the way I think you should, the way you're supposed to, I'm okay. But as soon as you do something that doesn't fit with my rules, I am knocked off balance. It's like I'm a puppet on a string. And when I give you my emotional center of gravity, I give you I make you my puppet master. And I hand you over the controls of me, the puppet. Well, that's not a great way to live our life. No matter what we hand those controls over, whether I'm handing over to someone that is my spouse, that I believe loves me, whether I'm handing over to a friend, whether I'm handing over to a parent, whether I'm handing over to some stranger that I just meet. I never want to abandon as an adult. Now, children, we are, of course, dependent. I'm not talking about you as a child now. I'm talking about you as an adult. As an adult, I never want to give anyone my emotional center of gravity. It's my job to maintain it and take care of it. And that's part of what we learn in this practice of emotional sobriety. Now, one way that this shows up is in this issue of when something happens to us that's difficult. Well, what is forgiveness? Well, let's look at the definition that the American Psychological Association offers. It says willfully putting aside feelings of resentment toward an individual who has committed a wrong, been unfair or hurtful, or otherwise harmed one in some way. Forgiveness is not equated with reconciliation or excusing another person. Please understand this. A lot of people fuse this together. We are not talking about reconciling or excusing another person's behavior. Not at all. We may be looking at understanding another person's behavior, but not excusing it, right? And it's not merely accepting what happened or ceasing to be angry about it. Rather, forgiveness involves a voluntary transformation of one's feelings, attitudes, and behavior toward the individual so that one is no longer dominated by resentment and can express compassion, generosity, or the like towards the individual. So if you got your iPhone and you want to take a picture of that, go right ahead. This is a great definition of the term. And I think it helps clarify a lot of things. We are not talking about even forgetting what happened. We're talking about working through our feelings about what happened. Once again, if I am injured, it's typically because I have put my emotional center of gravity in another person, and I've expected them to be a certain way. And then when they don't live up to that expectation, I end up very hurt or injured. We're going to see that one way of unraveling this stuff is to be aware of this process that goes on with us with this emotional center of gravity. But before we get into that, forgiving those who've hurt us or betrayed us is the key to addressing our unfinished business with them. We forgive these people so we may release them from our expectations, and we got to do this for ourselves, not for them, right? We are working on forgiveness to set ourselves free. It's not to do something to them. It's something for us. We must remember that. And it starts, I think, in a very important way. So those of you that you were raised like I was, you were taught the golden rule, right? We treat other people as we would like to be treated. Weren't you taught that? I was taught that. That was the golden rule. Well, that's really not the truth. The golden rule is that we treat other people the way we treat ourselves. That's how things play out. So whatever kind of relationship I have with myself, I am going to project into the world. And that is the relationship I'm going to have with others. So if I am black and white with myself, guess what I'm going to do to you? I'm going to be black and white with you. If I am a perfectionist, which I am, and I think we all are. It's last time, if you listen to my talk about perfectionism and working through it, every one of us has these perfectionistic ideas. I am going to project my perfectionism onto you. If it's not okay for me to make mistakes, guess what? It's not going to be okay for me for you to make mistakes. If I don't know how to forgive myself for things that I've done wrong, what makes me think that I can forgive you? Well, I can't. You see, this starts in terms of our relationship with ourselves. So before you get into healing some dealing with some other situation with another person that you're struggling with that's hurt you in some way, you've got to first look at how you deal with what you've done with yourself. Have you forgiven yourself for your own transgressions? Have you given yourself for violating your own values? Have you forgive yourself for acting in a way where you've impinged upon the rights of other people? See, if you haven't done that, then don't get busy with trying to forgive someone else. Get to work on this relationship with yourself. Well, the question is, how do we do that, right? How do we start to forgive ourselves? So what is this self-forgiveness and how does this look like? Well, we've got to deal with the part of ourselves that's our internal judge or critical parent. See, each and every one of us, Freud early on talked about these different parts of the mind that he talked as the id, which is the irascible child that just wants everything to go his way, right? And we all start the world as just a pure id state, right? And then through, interacting with life and our parents and stuff, we start to develop an ego. And the ego is kind of the adult part of yourself that deals with reality. Well, as we continue on in our development, we also develop what Freud called the superego. That's your conscience. Now, later on, people that did the transactional analysis, Eric Berne was the founder of that movement. He talked about the parent, the adult, and the child as representing those different ego states, right? And so if you think about it, is that we can easily divide ourselves up into different parts. Well, every one of us develops a part of ourselves that monitors our behavior, that tells us what we should do and what we shouldn't do, how we should behave, how we shouldn't behave. And early on, all of that is determined by shoulds, because what we're doing is that we're assimilating all of the values of our culture to be able to operate within our culture. So all the rules about what our behavior is supposed to look like. Well, that's important. We all need to do that. Look, if we all go, end up at a stoplight, it's important if it's green that we go. And if it's red, that we stop, because you and I know what happens. If everybody's going and you come up at the stoplight and it's red and you go, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be an accident. So we all come up with some kind of a consensus about what these rules are that we need to happen in order to live together in a society. Well, we also develop rules about not just driving a car, but driving ourselves as a person. How am I supposed to operate in this world? And so we come up with a set of pretty much, rules that we're all going to agree on, that people should behave like this and people should behave like that. If we were live and I had a chalkboard, we would be able to put on one side of the board things that we should do and one side of the board things we shouldn't do as a person and in terms of our behavior. Now, does everyone adhere to that? No. A lot of people come up to the green light and they stop, or people come up to a red light and they go, and hence that we end up, stepping on the toes of our fellows, doing things that are harmful, acting out all kinds of ways. And, and look, the truth of it is that some people develop in a way that, as Scott Peck called them, is people of the lie. There are people out there that are just evil people. And it's important to understand that. So I'm not talking about those people that don't have a conscience. I'm talking about you and I, the majority of us, that pretty much have this part of us that's constantly monitoring our behavior. Well, what happens if the ideas you have about who you're supposed to be are rigid, are very absolute and black and white, that either you're good or you're bad? Either you're right or you're wrong. Well, what happens when you behave those ways? Well, then there's going to be a part of you that unleashes, hell on you. We call it, you unleash a lot of self-hate, and you start hating yourself, despising yourself for who you are, because you're not being the person that you should be. Now, every one of us has made mistakes in our life. No one among us is perfect, as Bill said, right? The point is that we strive, to make progress along these lines. But the part of us that judges ourselves is not that generous. It's very harsh. So self-forgiveness sometimes involves dealing with your harsh superego that demands that you should be something that you're not. Earlier today, I was talking to a mom who feels terrible, a lot of guilt and shame about the way she showed up for her son earlier on in life. And she judges herself so harshly. She was a terrible mother. She should have done better. Her son ended up being put in an institution. And when he was in this institution, some terrible things happened to him. And she's always felt a certain amount. She's always felt very responsible that happened, and that she somehow wasn't there and didn't provide him with certain experiences that would have prevented him from having to go into that institution. So she's taken incredible responsibility. Now, the part of that that's healthy is today she wants to be the best mom that she can be with her adult son. But see, this part of us that thinks that beating us up and being ruthless about the mistakes we've made, as that's going to help us become a better person, is a bunch of nonsense. I've never seen a person do better by making themselves feel bad about themselves. It just doesn't work. We don't work like that. You're not going to do better if you constantly tell yourself what a piece of shit you are. You're going to do better by having more compassion and understanding for yourself, and understanding that, yes, we've all made mistakes in life, and those mistakes are understandable. We need to learn from them. We need to unpack them. We need to see what was missing from our life, and we need to have some compassion that where we were then is we were doing the best we could with what we had. And that today we can take all of that information and do better today, but we can't change what we did then, other than have more compassion for ourselves about who we were. That's what I think of as self-forgiveness, right? Is that we've got to quit judging ourselves based on the consciousness we have today, and then evaluating what we did before with that consciousness. You're different today. You're a result of all of the experience you have, just like you were then. And from what I know about us is we're constantly trying to make the most sense out of our world and figure out how to actualize whatever possibilities exist given the circumstances that we're in, given the resources available to us both internally and externally, given what's going on in our environment. We're constantly trying to make the best sense out of things. So what I do to help people with this issue is I get them into a dialogue. I put them in one chair, I put their critical parent, their judging part of them, and I say, unleash hell. And I have them talk to themselves from that part of them that's being critical, and I just have them lay into themselves as harshly, with as mean-spirited as they possibly can muster up at that moment. And it is pretty ruthless what I see happen. Quite cruel, quite negative, quite critical that people have for themselves. Then I say change. And now I have them respond to that part of them. You know what the first response usually is? You're right. They agree with that part of them. So when they agree that they're just this piece of shit, it becomes two against nobody. There's nobody on their side. They've just joined forces with this critical part of themselves, and they have no ability to support themselves. When I suggest possibly that this other part of them can be wrong, they look at me like, are you crazy, Dr. Berger? How can that part of me be wrong? That's the part of me that's trying to make me a better person. I go, no, it's not. That's a part of you that's just beating the shit out of you. That's your bully. That part's not helping you. I've never seen a person become a better person by bullying themselves into being a better person. I go, this isn't helping you. This is making you feel terrible about yourself. Why don't you try to experiment with saying to that part of yourself that you're wrong? You're not helping me. You're wrong in how you're talking to me. You're wrong in the way that you're telling me I should be. I did the best I could. And yes, can I do better? I want to do better today. I can't change what I did then. So help me become a better person today. And it's not by telling me what a rotten person I was then, or how terrible I was, or how imperfect I was. That takes a lot of work to find the ability to stand up for yourself and to stand up to that part of you that's constantly putting you down, that's expecting you to be someone you're not for you to be okay. You don't get to okay by demanding that you should be someone other than you are. You get to okay by accepting yourself, supporting yourself, and learning and growing from your experience. That's how we do it. Well, we could do this whole presentation on self-forgiveness, couldn't we? But there is a process of forgiving others too, and it's a very important process. The work that I am going to talk to you about was done by Dr. Fred Lushkin. Of course, I put my own personal spin to it, but he wrote a book that kind of summarized the research that he did up at Stanford in a project where they were trying to understand what creates forgivenesses or what creates grievances so that they could understand how to help people forgive. And Stanford was awarded a huge grant by a few different international organizations because they felt like the issues that have been going on, let's say, in Ireland with the Protestants and the Catholics, or the issues that are going on in Israel between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that the political solutions on these things would never be enough, that there needed to also be a grassroots movement to find a solution to these problems. So his first job in taking on this project was to understand, how do we develop a personal grievance? What happens to us? Well, obviously, there's some experience that happens that threatens our world, that threatens our sense of security, or threatens our idea of how things are supposed to be. This is the important part. The next thing we do with that is we take what happened very personally. We say, this shouldn't have happened to me. You see, underneath that is this thing that Don Miguel Ruiz talked about. He calls it, we all are raised with this sense of personal importance. I like the way that Dr. Theodore Isaac Rubin talks about it, is he says, we all have this expectation that we should have a special status in life. Well, what is that special status? Well, everybody should know who I am and therefore respect me, therefore honor me and treat me well. Don't you know who I am, by the way? Well, you see, this idea that it's all about me sets us up for a lot of trouble, because as soon as I take what has happened personally, I am now busy with dealing with my objection to what's happened rather than to dealing with what's happened. Let me say that again. As soon as I've taken what's happened personally, I am busy with dealing with my objection to what's happened, which means usually having some kind of self-pity around it, rather than dealing with what's happened. Terrible things are going to happen to us in the course of our life. But if I take those things personally, it's going to be very hard for me to digest the experience and move on and grow from it, because I'm going to get busy with, why did you do this to me? God, why did this happen to me? I'm going to be like Job, but I'm not going to be as nice as Job was about it. You know, Job was talking to God. How could you do this? Listen, I was good. I was following your word. I'm a good person, and you're a good person. How could this happen? I'm not as nice as Job. I say, how dare you do this to me? I don't deserve this stuff. And I'm not nearly as good as Job was about these things. But we still object. When we object, it creates problems because now we're lost in the objection rather than with the experience. We get lost in it. This shouldn't have happened. This shouldn't have happened to me. This is not how life was supposed to be. And we get lost in that whole thing. Now, the third thing that he discovered, so this thing happens that violates a rule, right? Some unenforceable rule. The second thing that happens is we take it personally. The third thing is that we develop a narrative around the experience. And so we tell ourselves a story. If you've hung around Herb, you'll hear Herb saying, sometimes he says it quite harshly, all right, enough with your story. You know, you'll hear him say that. We all have a story. We all have a narrative. Every person develops a narrative about what's happened. In that narrative, we paint a certain kind of a picture. When we are injured in this way, what Dr. Lushkin discovered is we paint a picture that really portrays us as a victim of the experience that happened. And then we share this narrative both externally and internally, both overtly and covertly, millions of times. And every time we repeat this narrative, we are traumatizing ourselves again. Of course, these are micro traumas, not the same as the original trauma, but we are continuing to re-traumatize ourselves. So from a neuropsychological point of view, we're establishing a groove, right, in our consciousness, in our thinking, that's getting deeper and deeper because we keep traumatizing ourselves with the narrative that we've now constructed to explain and to describe our experience. We do that because we're trying to give meaning to it. So a great question to ask yourself always is the narrative that I've developed helping me or hurting me? Is it helping me cope with what went on, or is it keeping me stuck in an impasse? Is the narrative enhancing my encounter with life, or is it diminishing it? These are critical questions for you to ask yourself. Now that we understand that these are three forces, right? These are the three things that happen when we develop a grievance. One is that something happened that violated one of our rules about how life was supposed to be, how it should be, how we wished it would be. So it violated, and he called them unenforceable rules. They're unenforceable because we don't have the power to enforce them, even though in interpersonal relationships, we think we have the power to enforce these things by making the other person feel bad if they don't do what we want them to do. But in terms of society, there's no way. We can't call the rule police and say, please arrest these people. They shouldn't have done this. Well, yeah, but society may respond that way, but it doesn't change what happened. Second thing is we took it personally. They did this to me, it happened to me. How dare you do this to me? And the third thing is we come up with a narrative to explain this that continues to re-traumatize us from the experience. So after understanding what creates a grievance, they took the next step and to say, so now that we understand it, what do we have to do to help people reverse the process? So the first thing they did is they took these people that had these incredible grievances, Mothers that had lost children through a bombing, people that had lost people through some other kind of an act. And they helped them understand that what was violated was one of these unenforceable rules. Then they worked hard at helping them understand how it wasn't personal, that what happened is just what happened. It wasn't done to them. It just happened. Even if somebody did it to them, it wasn't because of them. It was because of the other person. So this idea that don't take anything personal that Don Miguel Ruiz talks about in the 4 agreements was something that they would really try to help people understand and accept. And here was the most critical part. After doing 1 and 2, the third thing they had the people do was to write a new narrative. A narrative that, instead of victimizing themselves from the experience, help them see themselves as a hero or heroine who is dealing with it. The narrative had to be empowering, not disempowering. Any narrative that victimizes us is disempowering. The narrative had to be an empowering narrative. After the person created this new narrative that they shared with the group and that the group helped them develop it really rock solid, right? Then they had to start sharing this narrative with others, reversing the process. The results were unbelievable. People who had been stuck with a grievance for years were now finding freedom. Now you can see everything I'm saying is doing what? It's putting our center of gravity in some experience that we had and bringing it back to ourselves and freeing ourselves by how we're digesting the experience. You see, when you digest a painful experience in your life, then you take from that experience that which will grow you, and the rest will be eliminated, just like waste is eliminated from your body. If you chew up an apple, you will take all of the nutrients from that apple that your body needs. The fluid, the vitamins, if there's protein available, anything that your body needs from that, and then your body will eliminate the rest through urinating or defecating. Our biological digestive system is a wonderful prototype for what mental health is. Mental health is when we digest an experience that has been difficult to digest, and we keep chewing it up and keep processing it until we take from it that which will grow us, and we let the rest grow. That's what Lushkin was able to do. He was able to help people rediscover this incredible organismic wisdom that each and every one of us has. You guys digest food and do this all day long if you have a normal digestive system. You don't have to tell yourself, hey, I'm going to extract protein today. I'm going to take some H2O out of this stuff, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this and get rid of that. You don't do that. It's not a conscious thing. It happens as a result of good digestion. That's what happens if you take an experience you have, and if you're mad about it, you scream until you've done screaming about it. If you need to cry about it, you cry about it until you're done crying about it. If you feel victimized, then you become that victim until you're no longer that victim. We have to learn to go with our experience rather than trying to control it. And when you do that, unbelievable things happen in your life.